Oops. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to get started very shortly. Just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Oops. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today. Lost my PowerPoint. Bear with me. Where did it go? Once in a while this happens. There it is. All right. Thank you all for joining me today and us today. My name is Lisa Hill. Just lost it again. It's a GoToWebinar special. There we go. I'm going to not even bother showing it. Sorry about this, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Hill, and I am joined today by Adam A. Smith and Dr. Walter Malone to talk about quiet quitting. Before we dive into today's presentation, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping, and I'll bring that slide up in just a second, Adam. I have no idea why it keeps crashing on me. Before we do that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping, mention to all of you that GoToWebinar is set up in a way that is a little bit unusual when it comes to communicating with us. We welcome questions, we welcome comments throughout today's discussion. In order to do that, to communicate with Adam and with Walter, please click on the questions box in your GoToWebinar module. It might look like a question mark, or it could say the word questions. I'm going to ask you to click on that right now and just type in where you're calling from, and that will alert us that you know how to ask questions. It'll also show Adam where the questions are coming in. And as you do that, I'm going to try to get my slide deck up again. I'm just going to have to do it this way, I think. There we are. Excellent. So thank you all for coming. Here we are. We have Pennsylvania, San Antonio, Texas, Marquette, Lubbock, Texas, Michigan, Florida, Iowa, Moore, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, Illinois, Florida, Tennessee again, New York, Texas, Alberta, welcome Canada, Bryn Mawr College calling in from Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wichita, and Kansas, West Virginia. I think we're hitting a lot of the states. Rainy and wet and snowy south. My goodness. Doesn't sound good, Christina. Moore, Alberta, Canada, Salt Lake City, Utah. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I apologize for the view of the slide deck at the moment. I'm having some technical difficulties. But we are going to be talking about quiet quitting today. Well-being, mindfulness, and privilege in a webinar series that we've been doing for more than a year now with Adam Smith. We are today sponsoring this webinar as Vault Firsthand. If you're unfamiliar with Vault Firsthand, it's a career building platform that engages job seekers, students, and professionals to find the right career path using the power of firsthand experiences. Without further ado, Adam, I'm going to hand off to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Really appreciate, first and foremost, InfoBase for making space for these conversations. If you all have been in community with us since we started this last January, which feels like a lifetime ago, we really appreciate it. I know there's a lot of frequent flyers who come back, whether the conversations are about employment-related things, trauma-related things, conversations about how to help and impact students in a positive way. It is so important, and we really appreciate you all finding time in your day, whether you're watching us live or you're watching us on the recording. Please remember that everyone will get a copy of the recording for today. If you have peoples, okay, who registered today, they will also get a copy of the recording as well, okay? So make sure to share that out. So if you're joining us via recording or live, we really appreciate it, no matter where you are in the cold, rainy. I think the one thing we have in common is no matter where you are, you feel like it's cold, right? So first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have space to acknowledge the caretakers in whose land we all are on. So if we can all just take some deep breaths. I know it's been a crazy busy day. If you're like me, can barely breathe, wake up and immediately get going. So if you can just, there's something about, like Elmo calls it, belly breathing, right? With Sesame Street, when you breathe from your belly, how that really puts you in a different place and helps really bring your blood pressure and your stress levels down. We acknowledge the land on which we sit and occupy today as a traditional and ancestral home of the indigenous peoples and nations. I acknowledge my roots on the stolen land of the Dakota and Ojibwe in Minnesota, and my current residence on the land of the Shawnee and Osage peoples in Kentucky. Please take a moment, use the question box, and put the name of the peoples whose land you currently occupy and reside. So if you can take a second and put, if you know the nations whose land that you are currently residing upon, if you can put their name in the question box. Without them, we do not have access to this gathering and to this dialogue. We take this opportunity to thank and honor the original caretakers of this land. We also honor our ancestors and the narratives of the people and their knowledge who have empowered us to share community today. Thank you all very much. So we have a really rich panel, but we have folks who are jumping in and jumping out. So quickly, I'm going to introduce myself, then give Dr. Malone the opportunity to introduce himself. I know we have Shelby Saylor on as well. When she comes on, and Jasmine Prince will join us. She is bringing students back from a trip, so she will join us in just a moment. So my name is Adam Smith. I do a lot of education work, justice work, healing work. Really, my work is really around transformational things, whether that be on campuses or in the lives of individuals. Love to build coalitions, do a lot of consulting. I host a podcast called Get Uncomfortable. So if you get a chance, check out Get Uncomfortable. It is a podcast around creating comfortable spaces for uncomfortable conversations, all the things we're not supposed to talk about at family gatherings. Do a lot of executive coaching and speaking. Here is my contact information. If you want to get in touch with me, love to continue to share and build community with y'all. Walter.
Thank you, Adam, and appreciate you having me on today as one of the panelists. My name is Dr. Walter Malone. I am a counseling psychologist, currently a staff clinician for a Tier 1 institution. Also have done a lot of work in higher ed, from being a director of a program that helps students as they acclimate to college. I've done motivational speaking and still do through my LLC, Motivate, and then consultant work through that as well as some success coaching. And again, my contact information is below, should you want to get in contact with me. Thanks again, Adam, for having me too.
Thank you, Dr. Malone. Really appreciate you. Shelby Saylor, I see your face. Look at my student right there. So we will get Shelby's slide up. We'll revisit the slides in a minute, but Shelby, introduce yourself. Tell us about you, your work, your practice, who you are, where you are in the world, friend.
All right. Well, one, it's so great to be here because I owe most of my adult level-headedness to Adam Smith, and he tamed the lion. So thank you, Adam. I work for a global fitness company, specifically in business development, but I have for many, many years worked in the nonprofit space, specifically leading out employee resource groups, managing teams of 300 plus people. I worked for the YMCA, so there's a lot of community outreach there and helping communities of color as well as just disenfranchised groups in general. But I grew up in a very different environment, and that's where I feel I can bring a different perspective to this conversation because it hasn't always been this. And I live in Cleveland, Ohio with my beautiful 6-year-old and work from home, which is wonderful.
The best part is when you see your students become world changers. Walter, right? I mean, all the money, all the titles after your name, all the other stuff, I'd trade all that for one Shelby Saylor. Okay, because you're a world changer. We're not just talking about the work she does, we're talking about the person she is. She's a mother. I need as many Shelbys to be mothers as possible in this world. So Shelby, can you talk a little bit about how these pandemics, right? Because it isn't just a global COVID pandemic. It's pandemics of racism. It's pandemics against violence on Asian and queer folks. It's pandemics of hate speech all throughout our political discourse. How have those pandemics affected your work, right? How you view work in your profession? How has it impacted your view? Because you grew up small town Ohio, grinding, right? It was all about get that degree. You then get a graduate degree because you got an undergrad in 3 years, okay? And then you get your graduate degree, and then you get out there. And how have these competing pandemics and even more, the other parts of your life, how have those changed how you view your profession and your work?
For me specifically, with the pandemics, I've really changed how I show up in a space. Being a leader and someone that people look up to, for many years, being a young manager, young director, climbing the ladder quickly, I had to have a really strong executive presence, and I took my cues from people who came before me, all primarily white because privilege, and how they showed up at work. And I picked up all of these parts of my personality that just didn't jive with me very well. And so leaning into the pandemic, I saw it as the opportunity to show people that we're human again and make sure that all of our staff see us as vulnerable beings that are just figuring out the same way that they're trying to figure it out, and essentially brought me back down to their level. I've worked with dismantling hierarchies at the last 2 locations I've worked and creating more of a flat organization so that we're pulling more entry-level staff into higher-level decisions that impact them and letting them see all of these pieces so that we have other voices in the room. Because, again, a lot of the senior leaders I worked with were old white dudes, like, let's be honest. And we had to ask ourselves, as we're making these life-changing decisions, laying off hundreds of people, we're creating new employee resources and benefits to entice some non-financial incentives. Like, what is going to matter and make a difference so that we're not just running people into the ground, we're not causing insurmountable burnout, but we take this pivotal shift, this pandemic, to start elevating voices that otherwise weren't before, because so many people were getting displaced in their jobs. And it gave us an opportunity to lift up others as those jobs started coming back.
No, it's really good. I think it's really important, right, that what's happened is how people show up. Walter knows because we work at the same institution. You know, the Gen Xers are in charge now, and we were Jordan's boy, right? I mean, what was business casual? I mean, I'm at work today with a Be Kind crew neck on because we have to remind myself and others, right? But business casual used to be jeans on Friday. Now business casual is if you have some J's or some Chucks and it's the right colorway and people are wearing, you know, if you have hats and if you have a nose ring and you're living your life, you can show up as you are, right? And noticing those things. The concept about quiet quitting is really this idea, as people talk about, of folks prioritizing that work isn't their life, right? And how I frame it is the millennials were right. Because all the Gen Xers and Gen Ys and boomers used to look at the millennials and say, what the hell is wrong with them? They just want to live in their parents' basement. They don't want to do any work unless it has purpose. And they only do things that fulfill them. And they want to take, all it took was some pandemics for us to realize work is not that freaking important. And so realizing how you can do that while at the same time pivoting. Walter, can you talk a little bit about those standards and practices of professionalism? Because that's what Shelby's talking about. how they're grounded in kind of a colonialist, at times white supremacist ideology, right? That is also patriarchal, that says this is what it means to be a leader. One of the biggest shames I see is when intersectional folks, Black folks, brown folks, women get in leadership roles and act like cisgendered white men. Or even worse, why don't you just show up being you, right? You finally got a shot, let's shoot it your way. So Walter, your practice, not just your work, but your practice as a clinical psychologist, talk about how those standards of professionalism can do harm to people, right? Because you're trying to be something that is completely the opposite of who you really are.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think the one thing that comes to mind, and as I was thinking about this, was the authenticity, right? If we view whatever professionalism is, right, because it has these criteria that you and standards that you have to meet, whatever those things are within the culture or the environment that is being established, if those things are not aligned with who we are authentically, then now we have to choose as to who we have to become, right? And so oftentimes we hear these conversations about what's the term that's being used? Being unauthentic, or what's the term that students often use when they go to class and they don't feel like they belong in class? Remind me, what's the term?
I don't know.
Gee, it's escaping me right now. But we're showing up trying to fit into this box that doesn't feel like who we are, right? And if we have to be something that we don't feel connected to, then now we have these internalizations about who we are, and about who we have to be in order to thrive within this within the environment. So we see that that takes place in the classroom, that takes place in the workplace. Individuals don't talk about things that align with who you are, and you feel like because those things are not happening, and I'm speaking from a personal standpoint, because those things are not happening, then you don't feel like you belong, because people aren't talking about the things that are important to you. That very much so represent that job. You don't feel like you can connect, and so there's those internalizations that's happening, and psychologically that can be draining. The energy that you have to use to show up, to be something that you don't feel connected to. I mean, that is draining. That is exhausting. And then not only are you dealing with that from a person of color perspective, but now you have to meet all these other expectations on top of that. And so there's double the work to show up in an environment that's not even representing who you feel you are, and connect to like your culture or your values or your norms.
Yeah, and people put in the chat imposter syndrome. That was on
imposter syndrome. That's it. Yeah,
right?
It's been a long day.
Tip of my brain. Y'all, thank you so much for putting in the questions. Please,
thank you.
I don't want to be the one asking all the stinking questions here, y'all. I got a whole list, y'all know. But you all ask questions. We have experts here that would love to answer your questions. We can have a dialogue like we're on Red Table Talk. We can do that all day. But let's make this a conversation. So put anything there. The one piece about imposter syndrome, and as whether you are a young professional woman, white woman like my scholar Shelby Saylor, or you're an old head like me and Walter, we have to call it, imposter syndrome is a disease. Imposter syndrome is the result of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and misogyny. So when it's almost like, oh man, I got to cure my imposter syndrome. How about we cure the racism that caused it in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And so it's different. So the one thing I'll tell all of the 100 people that are watching today and the people that are watching recording, keep in mind that there is nothing wrong with you. Of course, you're going to think you're an imposter if you grow up in a culture that tells you you are not as valuable, or because you are a woman that you don't have place and space being authentically who you are, right? And so to feel like in your brain that you're constantly being watched feels like being the squirrel in the middle of the highway. You don't know which way to turn, right? When our DNA is calling out for something different, right? We didn't only know the important, and diversity isn't just race and gender and orientation. Diversity is age and experiences, which makes us rich. But the difference is we're now having a workforce that's saying, I ain't gonna take it, okay? I'm gonna come and just do my job. And quiet quitting doesn't mean you're coasting. Quiet quitting means you're not doing the social activities outside of work. You're not prescribing to the work twice as hard to get you just as far mindset, right? Shelby, talk about that, because you mentioned you're a mom, right? You're working remote, but working remote, we all know now, isn't a cup of tea. I've got to balance these things because work doesn't belong at home. I've got to be able to shut work off. I know the kind of worker you are and the kind of leader you are. So talk a little bit about how you have chosen to put boxes around work so it doesn't overtake your life and the things that are more important.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think it's important to call out that I'm an extremely hypervigilant person. I go to work every day. I don't know if it's deep in my psyche or what it is, but I show up at work every day afraid that today's the day that they're going to walk in and tell me I no longer have a job. No matter how successful I am, no matter how many results I'm putting up on the board, right? Like there's an inherent fear around what have I done wrong that's going to cause me to lose my job? And I think a lot of that comes from anxiety out of the pandemic and having to let so many people go myself that did not deserve it. And seeing behind the scenes, what little pieces were the reasoning. Like it took much less to let people go throughout that time than what it does even now. But these last 3 years, like you show up to work late, like, sorry, you're just not putting in enough time and effort to be a valuable part of this stripped down team. So kind of putting that there as a starting point of hypervigilance and how I create boundaries, because those two pieces work against each other a lot for me, of like, I want to show everyone I'm the best, but I also need to create boundaries because people are looking at me as an example. And that's what drives it for me as a leader, as a mentor, as a supervisor, is if I'm showing people that the way to get things done is by putting 80 hours of work in a week, like I'm not helping them and I'm not helping myself because I'm setting unrealistic expectations of the output that I can create. So that was my motivating driver, especially in this work from home, create boundaries where you can. When my daughter's home from school, there's a Squishmallow. She hangs out in here, right? And I bring that vulnerability to work and I tell people, I expect you to do the same. If your kid's at home, I want to see them. Like inviting the humanness in and making it known, and also setting those boundaries where there's going to be nights that I work like a machine because there are deadlines and things have to get done. But if I'm sending emails, they are scheduled for the next morning so that my staff aren't getting emails all night thinking they need to respond. And the other nights, the weeks that I have my daughter, because I co-parent, there is a hard stop at 4 o'clock. The computer turns off and whatever there is to do tomorrow is going to have to wait until tomorrow. Because we live in this digital age where she's growing up when I'm not in my office working, I'm on my phone checking emails or I'm scrolling social media, and she doesn't know the different channels that I'm like in. But to her, she's seeing this as mom's always in front of the screen. Why can't I be in front of a screen 24/7? So if it were up to me, I would have zero boundaries at work. Like I love working. It fulfills me. I have a lot of my own confidence comes from the type of worker I am. I grew up in a blue collar family. But when I came to the realization that hard work isn't the key all of the time, I was able to pump the brakes and say, how am I creating this toxic culture around me? I am responsible for other human beings. Like, yes, between the hours of the time you log on and the time you log off, you should be working hard. But I need you to rest as hard. You're more of a liability to me than an asset when you're burnout. So,
and leading.
I look external.
Right? Well, and leading that with your team is something that's so critical, because it can't be, I expect people to work like I work. Because the truth is, in this workers economy, people tell us to kick rocks. I'm out, bro. I'll go work at Lowe's and work. I'll pour beers at the local bar. It's not a big deal to me. Now I'm getting $25 an hour to do that stuff. Walter and I never would have gotten an undergraduate degree if we got $25 an hour to work at Target. We're like, shoot, what's the point? We're trying to make $25 an hour after college. So I think all the things that you're saying, Shelby, are so relevant, right? Knowing when to say when. I love the idea because everybody that knows me knows they get emails from me at midnight, 2, 3 in the morning. I have a disclaimer. My work time is not yours. I do not expect you to respond to me, but that's the only time my brain can be still, right? So I'll sit and find that and do shit because I can't do it because my whole job is political meetings. I mean, I got to have some doing in the middle. We are joined in the meantime by my friend and colleague, Jasmine Prince. Jasmine, you want to introduce yourself to the crowd, tell a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get to get you a question real quick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Prince. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am an educator, an entrepreneur, and an encourager. I've been in the higher ed space now for 6 years professionally, and have loved being on college campuses. And I'm also a millennial, and so when Adam, we first had this conversation about, have you heard about quiet quitting? I had recently learned about it on TikTok, and I was like, oh yes, I do know about this, and I'm liking what I'm seeing, the discourse that it is causing on TikTok, and so would love to add some insight. And so, Adam, thank you again for that invitation.
So Jasmine, talk about, because the old heads on here aren't aware of the TikTok revolution that quiet quitting has caused, right? This whole quiet quitting thing. So talk about some education as the TikToker in the crowd. And then can you talk about how that lands different, is different as a Black woman, right? And how there's some privilege to quiet quitting that many people of color just can't do. We are still straight up micromanaged. We are still told we got to be to work at 8 and leave at 5. We are still prescribing to a cultural worldview that is not our culture. We just did a land acknowledgement of a group of people. I grew up in Minnesota. I have never known a powwow that started at a time, right? It starts at a day and it ends when people leave. There is no worldview that is like a Northern European, that it's about being on time, not about what you do with the time. So talk a little bit about, give us some TikTok education, sis. And then if you could, talk a little bit about how some of this quiet quitting stuff lands different as a Black woman.
Sure. I believe my introduction to the term of quiet quitting was actually a woman of color who's a creator on TikTok and does sort of like role plays about boundaries at work. And I just kept seeing her stuff on my For You page, and I was like, ah, she's kind of funny. And then I realized, like, oh, like these are things that have actually happened to me. And then when she shared the term about quiet quitting, I was like, oh, yeah, that's sort of what it feels like. That feels like what the concept, right? That I think even as I stepped into my professional career 6 years ago, that I never had words for, right? But I remember in grad school really being like, why do the graduate students have to work 40 hours a week and that's not the contract that we signed? Like, because the supervisor works 40 hours a week, or because the supervisor really works 40 hours plus, because you don't have work boundaries, right, that reflects like where your priorities are. Like, but is that the life that I want to live? Is that what I want to follow? And so I quickly realized that a lot of the leaders that I had seen, particularly in higher ed, like no one had modeled what it looked like to just do your job and be satisfied with doing your job. And all of my supervisors had been women of color. And so I was emulating what I had seen, right? Because I thought, like, these are great professionals. These are people that I look up to, that have mentored me, that really have like never steered me wrong, right? As I've grown, like as I'm been growing professionally. And then I realized, like, oh, I actually don't want to do work life like the way that y'all do it, because there is something about the way that you are operating within your work that I was like, I don't like this. I don't like what it does for your family. I don't like what it does to your relationships or to your mental health. And so I began to just communicate those boundaries. Like, at 5 o'clock, I will be going home. Thanks. And I recognized that as the youngest person on the very first team I worked on, that a lot of people have issues with that, right? Because it is very much like, you've got to earn your stripes, and you're a Black woman, so like all these Black women put in all these extra hours to get where they are and to lead in this institution, and so you need to do that too. And when I begin to say, like, I'm not doing that because I've done my job for the day, and I've done my job for the day. And that for a lot of people that were older than me was like very distinctive. And I think I recognize the privilege in that, and being able to say no is because, one, I think I know the kind of work that I do. And so I know that no one would challenge me on, well, the work is not done, or that you didn't meet the deadline. But I think even if they had that, I was really just owning that, like, my identity outside of who I am as a professional matters more than who you're going to tell me that I am as a professional, because I stay late, send emails at 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, at night, went above and beyond with no thank yous because someone alluded that I needed to do that. And so I think that, yeah, for Black women, it definitely is a hard thing to do because we often don't see quite putting modeled for us. And so if the people that are modeling what professionalism is, if they look like us and they don't model it well, I think we have dissonance on our own and sometimes struggle to be able to articulate, like, what is this I'm feeling and why am I feeling it, and how is this important to me to create some boundaries.
Thank you, Jasmine. Really good. We're getting some feedback. If y'all can make sure when you're not talking to mute, that might be what's going on. It's probably Walter. He's looking confused. You know, Dr. Malone.
Muted, man. I was
With a whole doctorate, bro, from Detroit. Uh, so, I mean, one of the things that Shelby or that Jasmine was sharing that just rings so true, because I'm that generation, right? I'm a 90s kid, went to college in the 90s. There's not a job I've had that anyone had before me. The program that Shelby Saylor was a part of was not there when I came to the University of Akron. I had 11 students. It is now the greatest college success program in that state because of people like Shelby, right? The work that I did at Bama, nobody had done before. The work that I do at Kentucky, no one had done before. So because of a life filled with trauma and abuse, I can endure and lift harder than others. Like, you're not going to outpain me. That's just the reality. And because I was, I studied to be a pastor, I see where we're going. It isn't a question of where we're going. So one of the struggles that we often do, especially as people of color, right, is we pride ourselves in the work twice as hard to get just as far. And what happens is, that is also in the back of our minds followed up with, but the only reason I've got more than them is because they just weren't willing to bust their ass and climb over the glass on all the white supremacy and anti-Blackness and misogyny and discrimination against people with disabilities. So you can, rather than blaming the thing, right? And so one person asked about quiet quitting as it means different things. I think to different generations, it means different things. When you're sitting here with two millennials, and right now with Gen Nows and our post-war generation, they will not work like their parents. They've seen us give up everything for a job, and our marriages fall apart, our lives fall apart, our health falls apart, everything falls apart, and they see the world falling apart in front of them, and we're the ones that did that stuff. So they don't believe any of it. Walter, one of the interesting things that I wanted you to talk about is there's a huge part of our ego that is tied up in what we do for a living, not who we are, right? There was a part of my life that I have thousands of Shelby Saylors. I only have one Shelby Saylor, but I get thousands of freaking students whose lives are different because God blessed me to be here. And they weren't enough because I didn't get paid enough money, or I needed another title, or I needed this, or I needed that. Talk a little bit about how much of our ego is tied up in being busy and working hard in our profession, right? and always striving for more title, more money, more power, right? It isn't money is the root of all evil, it's the love of money, right? And so this need for more. And how does that come internally and not come from others, right? So there's pieces of our unhealthy relationship with work that comes from us. We're all successful people, right? That is, well, if I just make X, if I just get this title, I can promise you, the higher up you go, the less power you have. Jasmine Prince, you know my title. Okay, I make no decisions. I gotta ask questions down, out, and up for everything, right? So talk about how the ego is the enemy in a lot of this stuff, Walter, right? And how for us, we have to quit first within ourselves and say, you know what? But to some people, I'll never forget when Derek Chauvin trial is happening and the verdict is getting ready to be read, and I'm in a Zoom meeting with people at my institution. And nobody acknowledges it, but essentially all the people of color have quit on Zoom. Like, you ain't seeing us, like we're all here, right? And we aren't talking to each other about not being here. We haven't even talked. You just ain't gonna see us since you don't see us. You know they're getting ready to try to convict this dude or not convict this dude of killing our brother. So talk a little bit about how ego impacts these things.
Yeah, you know, I think it's interesting. I think it could be ego in some situations, and I think that there may be a gender component to that as well, and how that shows up for men and differently for women. But I also think it is a fight for status and recognition, right? I think a lot of times where you're trying to be seen and you feel invisible in a situation, and you're putting so much effort to be valued, to be validated in the work that you're putting forth, and more things are being asked, where that can show up as, oh, well, they must value me if they're asking all these, asking me to do these things. No, I'm just being taken advantage of, especially if it's not showing up in my pocketbook, right? And so I think sometimes, I think the ego may come into play in terms of wanting that shine, wanting that status, wanting to be seen worthy. But I also think that there's a component to that where those things are not happening, and you want people to see what you're doing because you don't have those individuals that are acting as sounding board. You don't have those individuals that are sponsoring you and talking about the work that you're doing behind the scene. You don't have those individuals who or managers coming up to you and congratulating you. And so that can feel very deflating. And it's like, wow, I'm doing all this stuff, but I must have to do more and more in terms of this work, because I'm not getting seen like I should be, like I know I should be, and I'm not getting that recognition or that validation that I should receive. So I guess in that instance, I think it can be twofold for individuals who need to give more or to place their value into their work, and it's more about them and looking for the shine. I think ego can play a huge role into that. But individuals that's just looking to be seen, I think that might not be ego.
Right. Well, and I would add, seen by systems that are designed not to see us. The work that Shelby does, the woman she is, the system she's trying to break, right? This is all Game of Thrones. She's trying to break the wheel, okay? Right, Shelby? So all Shelby said was trying to do is break the wheel of a system that wasn't built for her, though. So it isn't just fighting people. I'm trying to be seen by a system. We work in institutions that were built without us in mind, right? To keep us out. And then we want to be recognized by them? Hell no. The question is, recognized by whom, right? Can I be recognized by my students? Can I be recognized by my colleagues? Can I be recognized by my partner? Can I be recognized by my friends and my relationships? Because your vocation doesn't have to be your work. Yes, I have a vocation that I'm called to, but it wasn't until I started having my work and my vocation separate. They do this sometimes, but the University of Kentucky cannot handle 100% of Adam Smith. I promise you, the University of Akron could. And so at some point through all that trauma, I had to realize, okay, I've got to find other places that are more healthy to put this energy into, because I cannot be a war machine where I work. Because to me, I'm called to this. Shelby will tell you, I woke up doing this stuff. Okay, I went to war with my student who was in my Running Start Summer Bridge program, who's from Coshocton, Ohio, who was telling me all the things that she didn't know and da 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 da. But I loved her at the same time. And so those stories are all really, really real to me. Shelby, talk a little bit about, because Stephen asked a question that he's struggling with the wording on quiet quitting. And he said to him, it applies something negative. And that people are basically kicking it into, basically putting it into cruise control and not working. Talk about quiet quitting and what it really means to you from a positive point of view, because I think you've done a good job with that. But talk a little bit about Stephen's question or comment, where he thinks it's much more about people taking back their life or taking ownership over themselves and their futures. Oh, she froze. Shelby, you're muted. You're muted is going to, I'm going to buy a t-shirt that says you're muted. She's working on it. So meanwhile, while she gets unmuted, Jasmine, one of the things that someone talked about or somebody's asking about is the importance of as a young professional of credentialing and resume building, right? You basically have to build a resume and you have to grind. And that means sometimes doing additional projects. That means sometimes getting outcomes of the work you do. That means sometimes doing upskilling or reskilling in your work, doing professional development pieces. So how do you balance, you don't always want to make the money you make, Jasmine Prince, right? Right? Yeah. So how do you balance that and then staying healthy and understanding that work may not be the only source of doing that? How do you build your resume in other ways?
Yeah, I think about the things that I've said yes to that were not in my job description have been things that like I was already interested in, even if I didn't work in the office that I worked in. So I teach a university transition course. I've always wanted to be a teacher. And so that was an opportunity to connect with different students who are usually like not in the cultural center that I work in. And to just like meet new folks at the institution that aren't always in the work that I do. And so for me, I think as I've thought about things that I've said yes to, whether that's committees, that's extra work like teaching or coaching, they typically are aligned with things that I already was interested in, curious about. And so although it's extra work, it's things that like I've already placed value in. And so it is an easy yes. And knowing that like, okay, this shifts maybe some of my priorities, maybe during work, right? I'm teaching during the day. I don't teach at 6 o'clock when I'm off, right? And so I think that really it's about knowing like what matters to you when you think about the things that you say yes to, like what skills are you trying to gain, and not just saying like, oh, I'm building my resume because I want to say that I've done this, this, and this, or because like I think these things would look good. But are there projects, opportunities, things that you could get involved in within your job or even in the community where you're really invested in the work that they're doing? Because I think it makes it easier to show up and to do whatever your part is in that work. But when I think about the reason why it needs to be on my resume is because like I have a skill or I have knowledge that I've gained because of that, that has informed who I am as a professional. And so when I look at things and I think through, am I going to say yes to this or am I going to pass on this opportunity? One of the things now that I'm asking myself is, how does this inform how you are as a professional? Or how is this going to develop a skill that you don't already have, or a skill that you know that you're working to master? And I think just because like higher ed is a place where when you're the young professional, like people just ask you to do everything, that I've become very comfortable being like, thanks so much for thinking of me. Here's some other folks that I think might be better fits for this opportunity. Please let me know if some other opportunities come up. And like, let's stay connected. And so I think framing it in that way for me has been helpful, because it becomes like, I'm not saying yes to everything. And if I've already gained the skill in some other way, then I usually don't say yes to that, because I don't feel the need to do that just to say that I can put it on my resume.
Ooh, so what, and this leads into, Shelby, hopefully the thing's working. This leads into the question we asked you, because what I hear you saying, Jasmine, is you aren't performatively saying yes. I'm not saying yes to build my resume. I'm not saying yes because I feel like I have to. I'm saying yes because I choose to, because it's something that fulfills me. For dang the resume, this is something I want to do for me. And it's one of the things we can offer, right, as higher education institutions, where Shelby works, the work she did at the YM, right? We are never going to be fully remote campuses. What we do for a living is a face-to-face business, and we aren't doing that very well a lot of the times, right? So I can't tell people send 33,000 of your babies to our campus, and then all the professionals are just going to be at home up the road. That doesn't work, right? We need more people with eyes on students, right? And eyes on people to build the love on them. But the reality is we can offer the kind of opportunities you're talking about. If that means teaching, if that means working with Black soil and doing fair share, if that means, whatever it is that interests you, that's what we can offer that ed tech can't offer, right? We can offer community, we can offer robust development. And not see the difference in generationally, younger professionals don't see, I'm doing this to build my resume, I'm doing this to build my person, right? That's what I'm hearing from Jasmine. It isn't what I'm going to do in 10 years. It's, I want to do this because it gave me joy, because it was something I enjoyed. It was something in my wheelhouse. Shelby, talk a little bit, if you're good now, can you talk a little bit about the question about quiet quitting as a negative thing? And how do you keep that in your mind? Because you are a grinder, you are a hard worker, as something that is much more positive.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Great. So I think for me, I agree. I think putting the term quitting in anything has a negative connotation unless you shift the mindset around why people quit in the first place. Usually it is for a positive reason, right? It's either more money, more experience, something that excites you in a different way. You've plateaued, you've hit a ceiling, and you're typically chasing something better. So what I see it as is the opportunity for us to strengthen our relationships. I'm going to always go back to being truly human, because that's where I've seen the success. And what really I think quiet quitting is recognizing that we are all just these blobs of flesh out here, like trying to figure the world out. No one has it figured out, but I'm going to make sure I'm taking care of me, right? I don't have to have it figured out, because I know that that person over there also has no idea what they're doing. And the second you can realize that nobody has any clue what's going on, that's the day your life begins. And you can come to terms with, okay, so quiet quitting to me, in my mind, is trying to find the gaps. Like, what's wrong with where I'm at, and how can I grow in this area? A lot of it comes down to communication, right? You get asked to do these little tasks that aren't in your job description. Okay, why? As a leader, I've always been a big proponent of delegating the right task to the right people where it's going to grow them, but not to blindly just offload work onto people. So communication, why are you giving me this? Is there some greater purpose? Am I helping the organization in some kind of unique and different way, or you don't want to do this thing and you need somebody to take care of it? Because that's going to change how we have the outcome conversation of what do you expect from me. And then I go back to exactly what Jasmine said. We live in a yes world. where you feel guilty to say no. And this is a revolution. I see quiet quitting as that tough communication barrier that we're working through, generational barriers, and it's giving us the ability to find your no. It is just as important to figure out what you don't want to do as it is to figure out what you do want to do. And to me, that is quiet quitting. I'm just taking my time to figure out what I don't want to do. And I'm coming to terms with the fact that that's the thing that I don't want to do, and I didn't sign up for that. And that's okay. Like, get comfortable with saying no to people. That is quiet quitting, in my opinion.
Well, and I think, Walter, I'm going to come to you on the same question, because you're a dad, you're a husband, you're a clinician. I mean, you're not only carrying your own trauma from this world, you're carrying the trauma of a team of clinicians in higher ed spaces that have never seen students like this before. Walter, am I right? We ain't never seen this before. Yeah, I've been doing this 25 years. I can tell you what a student's going to do and what they're not going to do. What I can tell you now is I can't tell you nothing, okay? It's just like, okay, let's just see what happens, right? Because they're different. Because we have literally put in front of them on these devices a world war, hate and harm, and they don't trust anything we say. And then on top of it, you know, the people that work with us, they have real lives. We always say our students have real lives. The people that work with us have real lives too. And we got to give them the same grace we want them to give their students. So how do you, as a leader, as a clinician, more than anything, as a husband and father, right? How have you learned to quiet quit in your own way, to find balance? And what kind of advice would you have for others who, you don't get a PhD and be Dr. Walter Malone because you're not grinding, right? And you didn't get it to go be rich. I mean, we're talking about clinical psychology. So talk a little bit about what you've had to unlearn, Walt. Talk a little bit about what you've had to unlearn in this season.
Yeah, man, you was hitting on some things, man. I almost came and sat on your couch a little bit. I think if you don't have the capacity to perform at your optimal level, then what is the gift that you're giving others, right? If there's burnout in your life, then how are you showing up and giving your best of something? You know, in thinking about quiet quitting, I think in some of the articles that I've read and things that the attention seemed to be placed on the individual who's quiet quitting. But I think the reverse of that is the leadership that is now being put in place that is unaware of what's being communicated. What Shelby said sticks with me because I use this term. Are we humanizing individuals? Do we humanize people in their experience? Are we intentional in building relationship to really understand their functionality and where they thrive? What are their strengths? What are the opportunities or weaknesses in the areas that they can grow? Right? If we're just placing work on individuals and saying just show up and you just do your work and you got to grind it out, then what are we doing to the instruments of ourselves? What are we doing to the instruments of individuals that we are leading, right? And the psychological destruction that is taking place within the corporate world sectors or educational sectors. What are we doing to the people that serve them, and how can we then perform, right? And so these systems that are really created, that are really driving individuals to divulge more of what even they have the capacity to divulge, like that's not productive. So I think about myself, like how I have to show up as a husband. I have to show up as a father. I have to show up as a friend. These are important relationships in my life, and I have a responsibility to those things. If I'm at work and I'm constantly burning myself out at work, and then when I get home, I have nothing to give. And then I don't have a leader that's asking about how's things going? How's your family? You know, is this too much on your plate? What things can I take off your plate? If I'm not seeing that I'm cared for at an instant, it's time for me to make different decisions. I don't think that that's about quiet quitting. I think it's about, how do I create harmony within my life? How do I create balance in a way where I can function and really give into my humanity, right? I think that's really important. It sticks with me. So I think leaders need to understand, these systems have to understand the things that they're missing. Relationship is one of the most important aspects of building a productivity. When we invest into relationship, when we build that capacity, and we invest in individuals being human, people want to show up. And so I think this idea of quiet quitting, I think also leaders in systems, organizations, corporate sectors, they need to really look at what's being communicated. Because I'm like, I'm not putting my all into this because it's not worth it. Then there's something wrong with that.
Well, and as we talked about, Walter so well said, you know, the ability to quiet quit means you have some type of power, right? I was teaching my students. Shelby knows this class because we were talking about privilege. And first thing I asked them was, how'd you get in the building? And they don't remember. And then you say, well, but my mom, who's in a walker, literally with the tennis balls in the front, she knows how she would get in this building. It's a privilege to not know how you got in the building. So you start having these conversations about the use of power in things, and how isms are all about the ability to apply power to an individual or group based on a characteristic that they have oftentimes no control over, right? And quiet quitting implies that you have some power. Now, we have power as people of color, as women, as people with disabilities, to say, LGBTQ folks, hey, forget it, I ain't gonna work here. And I think people are taking a stand more and more. The challenge, and Jazzy, I want you to talk about this, the challenge is even more when you work in spaces that say, we are all about DE&I, because we're the liberals. We're the liberals. Those liberals scare the crap out of me, right? We're all about D&I, but we aren't going to see you, Jasmine Prince, not only as a valuable employee, but see you as a whole Black woman. We want you to be there so we feel good in our liberalness, right? But we don't want you to show up as the whole Black woman that you are. And as soon as you do, stand up and say, well, no, well, that's not your job. Well, no. It is always our job to ask questions about things that affect Black people. Bottom line, we are always going to do that. And if you aren't going to let us do that, then we will find somewhere else to work. We will quiet quit. We won't just quiet quit, we will quit. Okay? So Jasmine, talk a little bit about how quiet quitting is a power thing. You have to have power and privilege to do it. And how people of color, what I read was that only 5% of Black women post-pandemic went back to the job that they were working in before. They led the Great Resignation, like Black women, y'all always do, lead everything, okay? And said, I'm not going back to those places of trauma. So how does this intersect with all those diversity and equity? Everybody's got a D&I question, but are you letting the people of color that are there be their authentic selves and truly contribute to the organization, which struggles for a lot of people because contributing on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice starts with individuals. It starts with me and Shelby talking and saying, she's saying, Adam, you got to work on yourself. I'll be like, all right, I guess that's hard, rather than talking about structures and institutions and political parties. Jazzy?
Yeah, I think that as you were talking, one thing that came up for me is that understanding your agency is a different form of power. And it's not power in the way that we think about it within privilege, but knowing that you have agency in a job or in a role, right? Agency to ask questions, to communicate your boundaries with people, like that's a understated power, but I think is like the crux of what quiet quitting is about, is like understanding that you do have agency, because ultimately, like, if you don't want your work to be your life, you have to act with that kind of agency. I think particularly in the DE&I space, that quiet quitting actually becomes a bit more complicated, I think, in the DE&I space, because particularly within like these institutions, everyone has a DE&I strategy. Everyone has one. How they enact that, who's responsible for enacting that, how they're held accountable is a very different conversation. And I think because of that, DE&I professionals like always bear the brunt of what an institution says that they're doing or what they're not doing. And so I think, and I can speak for like the Black women I know in higher ed, that after the pandemic, we're like, we're out. Like, I'm not coming back to this institution. I'm about to be an entrepreneur. I'm pivoting to corporate because they don't pay me enough to like endure the kind of resistance that I'm enduring currently. And so I think for DE&I professionals, because there's a lot of resistance to our work, even with folks that are like liberal, there's a lot of resistance, because then we start to ask questions about like your privilege and your access. People don't want to give those things up. That quiet quitting, yeah, like it becomes more difficult, because if I decide like, oh, like my work ends here and I've done within what's been outlined within my job description, right? Or what I feel comfortable doing more maybe than my job description, that like when I make a conscious decision to not go 5 extra miles in this DE&I work, I recognize that sometimes that means that I'm looking at a colleague to do their part and they don't. And I have to be okay with saying, I did everything that I could to show up for my students of color, to advocate for them, to try to create space for them, to ask questions, to try to hold people accountable. And D&I professionals cannot be the only people wanting to carry the football and run to the end zone. Like it is everybody's responsibility to run the length of the field, right? And so I think I'm beginning to see, even like right within my own practice, that like when I go the extra mile for students into someone else's job function, then I rob them of their ability to like own what they're supposed to be doing within DE&I work. And if I truly want my colleagues to own the work that they have to do, and to show up for students of color in ways that matter to students of color, I have to give them the opportunity to do that. And I never will if I'm always, oh, your advisor like didn't help you. Let me pull it up. Let me tell you what exactly to do. Instead of saying, actually, you know what? I know Adam. I know that Adam works in advising. Let me check to see if there's somebody else maybe that could be helpful, but I'm not an advisor. So I'm going to ask your advisor to do their job to support you. And I'm going to help you and give you the tools, the resources, the language, so that when you go back to your advisor's office, you know how to navigate within like a different system. And so they can help you because you're speaking the language that they speak, right? Ooh. And that is something that I think like DE&I professionals, like that's a negotiation we make all the time with ourselves, but also with our colleagues. And oftentimes like, that's not something I'm telling my colleagues that are not folks of color, like, oh yeah, like I'm trying to negotiate between like, do I do someone else's job or not do someone else's job? Like we don't have that conversation. I think you just come to the realization that like, I've overstepped where my job starts and stops. And it is actually someone else's job to do. And so I'm gonna hold the institution accountable. Like I don't get an extra check because I advise a student on academics and I'm not an academic advisor. Like Adam, you're not running me an overload check because I did 5 advisors' jobs. And I wish you could, because I mean, like I would do that, but you're not, right?
Well, and the thing about it that you're adding, and Shelby, I want to ask you this question too, right? It's almost like sometimes employers take advantage of people's passion. You know, Shelby Saylor is the most passionate, okay? I've known her since she was in high school, okay? You're a whole grown woman, all right? Sometimes people take advantage of that level of commitment. We know that, so it's all the people who are the yoke bearers of the work, right? Who come, I don't stop being the executive director of advising when I leave the University of Kentucky. I'm that at the grocery store, at the Quickie Mart, anywhere in this city or in this world, I'm constantly talking to people, talking to students, helping people, trying to change people's lives. And oftentimes, those have been the old school in the cut people of color that have been like, okay, We're just going to stay in the cut and navigate things and fill in gaps and not codify the lift that people are making on campus. One quick story, Shelby, about people taking advantage of other people's passions in their work. I graduated from college because of a woman named Miss Evelyn, two people, Miss Evelyn and Dr. Timothy Mashie. Miss Evelyn was the maintenance woman in the theology building at Concordia University. Miss Evelyn's job was to clean the classrooms. She did. When Miss Evelyn retired, the university had no idea that Miss Evelyn was holding 35 students. Like literally, Miss Evelyn was everything. I needed to see Miss Evelyn every day. There were days she pulled me in a room and shut the door and said bad words at me because I wasn't doing what I was supposed to. There were days she said, baby, I understand. But when you do that work and you don't hold other people accountable for being advisors, educators, teachers, professionals to all people, all that does is create atrophy of muscles. And what it does is it doesn't change systems, right? Shall we talk about the same kind of things Jasmine was talking about the passion that you put into your work, and how does that sometimes feel taken advantage of? Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, it kind of goes back to what Jasmine said and better wording around the quiet quitting as a positive negative. It comes down to personal advocacy. I wish we could change quiet quitting to like loud advocacy, because that's where we need to get. So for me, when it comes to how people have taken advantage of my passion in the past, is I don't do anything I don't enjoy. Like I'm not going to put myself in a position where I'm not going to fall in love with whatever it is I'm doing. And where that becomes an issue for me is it becomes my status quo. And that is what people then expect of me 24/7 at all times, is this hyper passionate, hyper involved, and ultimately just incredibly kind person. I know that's a weird thing to say about yourself, but being able to empathize is one of the things I think that's been taken advantage of the most for me, because I've had to have the tough conversations that other people don't want to have, because I just know how they're going to feel and I can word it correctly. I'm like, I ain't their supervisor. That's not my thing. And they're like, well, but it's your skill set. And so that's where the personal advocacy piece comes in for me is, well, if that's my skill set, then you need to create a job for me with that skill set. And I love what you said, Adam, about everywhere you've went, they have created the job for you. Being passionate doesn't have to be a bad thing. You need to advocate for that passion is the problem, or inevitably it is going to be taken advantage of. You need to say, none of these jobs here that you're showing me are my strengths. You know, you've heard the story of if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, then you're always going to be, thinking that the fish is unsuccessful. So when it starts getting taken advantage of, make sure that you're advocating for yourself and saying, I do this because I love it. You're making me not love this anymore. And you're making me want to work less hard. And that's why I say I wish it wasn't quiet quitting as much as it was like loud advocacy for yourself. Because we can quiet quit all we want. But if we're not explaining the process of the systems we're trying to dismantle, if we're not telling people what it is we want instead of whatever the current system is, then we're going to keep being looked down on as like this lazy generation that, until everyone older dies off, it's just going to become this thing. Well, you're lazy. You're a Gen Z. You're a millennial. Like, we don't vibe with that. Okay, maybe I wasn't clear with what I want. Let me tell you how I want to move forward with this career. You will be so surprised by how much more people will respect you when you advocate for yourself. We always need other people advocating for us. But if you can't find your voice, quiet quitting is just going to be your norm, right? Nothing's going to change if no one changes. The actions need to be backed up with communication.
And that's so key, is making sure people understand the why. Walter, we're going to let you bring it home. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we started this just people being their authentic selves. One of the things I'm going to share with everybody watching, everybody listening, I'm going to put everybody's slides up. Make sure that you all take down these folks' contact information, okay? First off, shout out to InfoBase for giving us space to have conversations that are uncomfortable, right? And everybody in InfoBase, worldwide company, doing this and having these conversations and elevating thought leaders like Walter and Shelby and Jasmine today. Everyone right now says they're an executive coach, they're a consultant. The reality is I'm only gonna give y'all folks who I know are bad, okay? So they aren't just here to do a one-shot deal with y'all. If y'all want to follow up with them for coaching, for conversations, for support, for look, yeah, what you talked about here, but can you help me apply it to my organization, my company? These are the kind of folks that can do it in a really real, authentic way. Walter, talk a little bit about, as Lisa shares everyone's slides, talk a little bit about that showing up as your authentic self, right? And being in a space where you don't have to shrink for the work, because that can be providing stress too, right? Just bring us home on next steps related to what Shelby says, loud self-advocacy.
Finding my mute button. Yeah, I think that, so twofold with that. It's that one question that you're always asked as a freshman when you walk into the classroom, that UK 101 or a different class. Who are you? I think getting underneath that, understanding your values, and how you utilize those values to make informed decisions about your worth. Because that is the pinnacle of and the foundations of advocating for self, knowing your strengths, understanding what your talents are, and really demanding that be appreciated by the individuals that you are working for. Having the ability to advocate for yourself, as Jasmine and Shelby both talked about, is critical. I think the other thing, and I've always learned this, is to establish a sounding board, establish a network. I mean, I've never went somewhere without having developed a connection in a network for support. I cannot survive without that. I've been in spaces, predominantly white institutions. If had not been for my network, I could not have thrived. Because sometimes it's going to that strong counsel and saying, hey, this is what's happening for me. What are your thoughts? How do I work through this? Not that you don't have your own thoughts for you, but being able to have some people that can reinvest into you, help you to see clearly, because sometimes you get caught up in the craziness and crazy making, right, of these situations and environments. And so I think it's both those things: understanding your value, knowing what your worth are, and how those things are informing decision, and then also surrounding yourself with individuals that can be supportive and offer you some wise counsel to help you through the process.
Dr. Malone, thank you so much for those words. Again, thank you to InfoBase. Thank you to our panelists. Y'all as participants, we really appreciate you in being here, sharing space with us. Please understand how much we love you. We care about you. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Have a good day. Peace.